I do remember that, my nervous system was dysregulated because of that trauma. But I went into the doing mode. Like, I kept doing. And I don't know if that was just me, my nature, or that was part of my training. But I didn't really take care of myself. Until a few months in, I was like, okay, I need to get back to my own self-care. And yeah, if I wasn't skilled, I don't know if I would have known how to recognize my own feelings and process that, or know the skills of self-care or loving myself, because I did have to find my own identity too, after this.
Welcome to Coach Soul, the podcast where we explore therapeutic ways to the best versions of ourselves. I'm your host, Steve Hudgins. I'm a licensed professional counselor dedicated to helping you navigate life's challenges. In each uplifting episode, we'll discuss mental health, relationships, self-care, emotional well-being, and personal growth. Join me and with my co-host, Kenya Evelyn, a therapeutic life coach, where sometimes we'll even welcome special guests to our show that share their experience and expertise. So let's embark on this transformative path together and discover a healthier and happier you. All right, welcome to Coach Soul. And Kenya's out on vacation somewhere, enjoying the ocean waves. I'm for sure there somewhere in Georgia. Stacey Johnson, welcome to the show. It's going to be interesting because one of the things that we kind of talked about off mic is that oftentimes women communicate, but it seems like the therapy or the mental health doesn't catch up with the medical side of things. And oftentimes I think women don't have although you feel like you have support, sometimes it feels like you don't have support. So, Stacey, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yes, thank you. I'm happy to be here this morning. And yes, I've been a clinical therapist for about 25 years in the state of Ohio. Most of my clinical work has been in an alternative school, working with children with special needs and their families. But I've always kind of had some other clinical experience working either in hospitals or the mental health community center near us. And then about 4 years ago, it'll be 4 years in November, my husband passed away suddenly after 2 weeks of being ill, but it was 3 weeks after my stepfather had passed away. And so about 6 months to 8 months after he passed away, I needed extra income. I was still working at the school, but then decided to do some telehealth work to work with my schedule a little bit better. But I was seeing a lot of women that were dealing with anxiety, loss, and loss not just in the funeral type of loss. There was the losses of children moving out, so they became, now an empty nester. Some women where their children went no contact with them, divorced women that were experiencing loss. And so that was when I decided that I wanted to go beyond the state of Ohio. And since I could relate to loss as well, I started my coaching program, Anchor Resilience, where I help women work through that loss, but then also gain the skills to kind of rise above and be strong and find their own internal self and be resilient. What I found was that the women just lost them. Like they didn't know who they were.
That's a common theme. Even when, talking with couples, most women say, I don't know who I am. Because one of the things I do in therapy is I will ask, if we take away that you're a mom, a daughter, a sister, a wife, or whatever, take these assigned labels, who are you? And they have no clue.
Right.
Oftentimes we do the performance of the label that we've been assigned. And so it's important to be able to figure out who you are. Even as men, we seem to get lost in our identity. And I think this culture shows that men have been lost in their identity. And so I feel what you're saying here in that I'm curious, you mentioned, oh my gosh, you've had several losses happening. What presented you or what prompted you to get into therapy in the first place, becoming a therapist?
Oh gosh, I don't even remember. That was so long ago. Actually, I really kind of started when I was in my bachelor's program, and I've always been attracted. It always has seemed like the kids who were struggling the most socially and emotionally were attracted to me. In my earlier years, 16, I worked in a daycare. 17, I worked in a daycare. Then I started working at this day camp, and it was always the socially, emotionally kids that were struggling with, really back then, we wouldn't have known it, but maybe they've experienced trauma, but their behaviors were not matching what society kind of said they should act in public. And those kids were the ones that were always kind of like stuck to me. So I always thought I was going to go into teaching, maybe special ed. And then when I was in my bachelor's program at Edinburgh University, it's a teaching school. So I was like, I don't know if I want to be a teacher. I don't know if I'll find a job once I graduate. And so I went into psychology thinking that I would be like a school psychologist or something like that. And then once I graduated, I was working at a mental health hospital, like a milieu therapist. So I was just like an assistant to an adolescent unit. And one of the social workers was like, no, you don't want to be a school psychologist because all you're going to do is test people.
Right.
So you really should look into being maybe a counselor, because then you'll be able to do what you really want to do. And that was to help. That was to serve, the children, their parents. And so that's when I went into my master's at John Carroll University. And from there, as soon as I got my license, I went into a mental health agency, working with children, adolescents, and their families. And from there, I was, working with a local school with their special ed department, and it kind of went from there. And then I was in an alternative school for 20 years before I chose to go on my own. And so now I am doing some clinical work with private practice and then the coaching.
I find it interesting how our backgrounds shape us and form us into who we are today. But we still have a choice of how we deal with our past and not allowing it to define us, but us defining who we are. And so you have this opportunity, you become a therapist, and then you have encountered, your stepfather's death and then your husband's passing. I can't imagine what you were going through. Stacey, oftentimes people think, well, we're a therapist. We got our crap together. It's like, you got this. You shouldn't have any issues. Let's be real with our listeners and viewers here about, the impact that it impacted you and the form of shaping it had. So, was this all of a sudden for you and your husband? Was it a gradual process? Kind of walk us through that for us so that we have a better understanding of how we can connect with you.
Yeah. So my stepfather passed away very suddenly. He did not wake up one morning and I got a phone call at work. My mom was trying to get a hold of me. She could not get a hold of me because I didn't have my cell phone on me. And so she did call my husband, and my husband was able to call my office and was like, your mom needs you. So I left, and basically my stepfather did not wake up that morning. And when we got to the hospital, he had already been declared dead. And this was during the pandemic. This was in 2021, in the fall of 2021. So, things had been lifted, but in hospitals, people were not supposed to be visiting, but this hospital was very generous and allowed all the family to go into the emergency room and say goodbye to my stepfather. And then a day after his funeral service, my husband became ill, and it was COVID. He was at home ill for a week and symptoms weren't getting better. So I took him to our local ER. And when we got there, he was diagnosed with double COVID pneumonia, and he was placed in the ICU. And from there, they gave me permission one day to go visit him so that we could attempt to communicate, because we felt we were pretty young still. I was only 48.
Did you have children?
Yes, we have children. At the time when he became ill, one was 17 and one was 20. And so we had not really talked. When you're 48 and 49, you still think you have a lifetime. So you don't talk about those end kind of decisions of do we want to go on life support? What do we want? So they did allow me to go into the hospital room all garbed up to talk about these things of what were some of his wishes so that I could make those decisions. And he was in the hospital for a week and then he passed away.
Stacey, it's like out of the movie. We go through life thinking that we're untouchable, so to speak, that death is not going to touch us. And so we don't have a will or preparation or anything of those things. And then all of a sudden your world gets turned upside down.
Right.
For women that are listening to this podcast, what would be a piece of advice looking back that you would want to advise women of any age?
Well, one, make sure you have life insurance. I was fortunate enough to have it, or he have it. And that was decisions that we had made when our children were born. If he did not have life insurance, I do not know how I would have financially continued to live in the home that he had built. And so, life insurance, talk about those wishes,
Sure.
because you become, and it's a true thing, like that widow fog. Like decision makings, before heavy decisions were bounced upon the two of us. And so that was one thing that I realized even as a therapist, and I taught problem solving skills and I've taught,
Right.
I was like, at that time, things became very foggy. And I was like, I don't know if I'm making a right decision. And so I started second guessing myself. And so, I made decisions, and I continue to make decisions. Now I'm able to knock off some of the overthinking that I was doing in the beginning and cut it off. But yeah, talk to your loved ones, or even if you are a single woman, make decisions, have them written down so people know like what you want. But life insurance is a big one.
It is. We don't expect the unexpected.
Right.
But here's the one thing I want to draw out for our listeners too, is the fact that, Stacey, you're a trained professional. What would have happened if you didn't have that training as a professional and you weren't a therapist? You think things would have been different for you, and some advice or some things that you could present to those who are not trained and how to go through some of these things?
Yeah, that's a good question, because would I have been different in that situation? Probably. I do remember that, my nervous system was probably definitely, for sure dysregulated because of that trauma. But I went into the doing mode. Like I kept doing. And I don't know if that was just me, my nature, or that was part of my training, is that but I didn't really take care of myself until a few months in. I was like, okay, I need to get back to my own self-care, exercising and making sure that I'm recognizing my own feelings and processing that. And yeah, if I wasn't skilled, I don't know if I would have known how to recognize my own feelings and process that, or know the skills of, self-care or loving myself, because I did have to find my own identity too, after this, because I was no longer John's wife. And as my kids continue to grow, and they're making those next steps of moving out of the house, I'm not Madison and Morgan's mom. I am, but that's not all my identity.
Right. No, it's your world is upside down, and you made sensibilities, so to speak, of, these are the things that I need to work on. These are the things that I need to do. But, so often you and I talk to women, we talk to couples, we talk to men or whatnot, and we try to help walk through this pain that they're dealing with. But at the same time, you got your own pain. How are you doing it, your own pain, but yet dealing with pain of others as a therapist? Because we can't just up and take a sabbatical, so to speak. We're supposed to, but
right.
You're dealing with your own pain. You got people's other pain coming in. How much did that just kind of wreak havoc on you, dealing and juggling with kids, and you're having to move on through life? Was there any guilt because I got to move on life, but do I have time to grieve over my husband?
Right. Yeah. Because I did go back to work. Since I worked in a school, I was fortunate enough that, not unfortunate. His passing was right at Thanksgiving time. Then we were going 2 weeks later or 3 weeks later, it was winter break. So I was fortunate enough, and I did have a lot of sick time that I could have taken off a lot more time than I could have. My boss was very supportive and said, you have the sick time. If you cannot come back in January when we return from winter break, take the time that you needed. But for me, I felt like that routine was what I needed. Not everybody can do that, but that routine was my grounding. But then I also put things in place that, allowed me to recognize my feelings. So I started sandwiching my day with a grounding or a journaling practice in the morning and recognizing the things that I was grateful for. And then I was able to kind of go and do my day. And so, I would have to deal with sisses at school or kids, expressing things that maybe been very traumatic for them. And I just would be able to, I don't want to say shut it off, but I would recognize my own feelings, maybe even in that moment, and then work with those kids. And at the end of my day, I was exercising, so maybe I went right from work to a class. Then when I got home in the evening, I always ended my day with another kind of journaling practice or, just acknowledging the things that went well that day. So still trying to find the joy in the day and recognizing that if there's guilt came up, kind of identifying, because our feelings are no more about feelings now than I did when I first started my therapy practice 25 years ago, is that their energy and their feelings are telling us something. And so if I could recognize my feeling and I label it, then I could recognize why the thought that was kind of behind it. And so a lot of times if I felt that guilt, it really wasn't anything to deal with that actual problem. It was a thought that I had. And sometimes that thought was not a helpful thought. It was something that had nothing to do with the situation.
So I'm kind of hearing you say that it's important for us to identify our emotion, deal with it when it comes up. But you and I know that people come to us and they want to avoid the pain. They want to avoid the guilt. And so, it doesn't help, or we don't create a balance. And what I'm hearing is you try to create a balance within your own life because we know the two extremes. We get so busy and caught up that we don't sit and process with our emotion, or we go to the other extreme and we sit and wallow in those things. Do you feel like being able to take that time and walking through your own emotion, what helped you the most? Was it the journaling? Was it identifying? What helped you in the most that my listeners can connect with you and maybe try on their own to help within their own self?
Yeah, I think what helped me the most was identifying my feelings, because I can remember times when I allowed my feelings to come up. There were definitely days when I would get teary-eyed, or if someone asked me a question and I would get teary-eyed, but never recognizing that feeling and not being ashamed that you had that feeling. So, try not to apologize because I was crying, because my crying was definitely one way of releasing it. But then also just, even if you label it yourself, just labeling the feeling helped me process it for that second. And then I could kind of move on. But there were definitely more times when I would have to take a little bit longer to process my feel, label it and then do something. Deep breathing was definitely my best friend too.
Okay.
Just taking a breath, if someone asked me a question, if I kind of felt that overwhelm come up or something, just taking a deep breath before I responded helped as well.
If we don't identify our feelings, Stacey, we seem to get lost and drown. And oftentimes people say, well, they feel numb. I mean, I imagine you felt numb. All of a sudden, husband's gone. And it's like, I don't have a feeling. I can't feel. Mm-hmm. And so if we don't identify, doesn't that lead to, dysregulation of our nervous system and things like that? Because that's part 2 I want to get into. So if we don't identify emotions, what would have happened?
I could have continued to stay numb. Maybe I would have, isolated more or looked at other negative coping strategies, because if I don't want to feel, I try to numb them out even more, and that nervous system, when it's dysregulated, we want to fight more. So we, snap at loved ones. Maybe we argue more, or the fleeing, where that's probably where I was in the beginning. Was I just kept doing, trying to like stay 1 foot ahead of everything else. And then the people pleasing with the fawn, I was definitely found myself, probably that's where my guilt kicked in more, was wanting to give to my kids. Because if I give to them, maybe they wouldn't feel the pain, and recognizing that necessarily probably wasn't always the best decision either.
It's interesting because here we are as therapists. We're supposed to be the experts. I tell my clients, don't put us on a pedestal. I'm a human being. I still have emotions. I still deal with things. And so, it's important to identify, in this part 2 coming up in our podcast, Stacey is going to rejoin us again, and we much appreciate this time well spent with her. And we hope that you find this information valuable. And we want to be able to help in the second podcast talking about the dysregulated nervous system. Again, appreciate your time, Stacey. And so until next time, take care and God bless. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode on Coach Soul. As we wrap up, we want to remind our listeners of a few key points. This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not substitute professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The content shared here is based on professional opinion but may not apply to everyone's situation. Always consult with a qualified healthcare provider before making changes to your mental health care. If you're in a crisis, please seek immediate professional help or contact a crisis hotline. Listening to this podcast does not create a therapist-client relationship. For personal advice, please consult with your licensed mental health professional in your area. Remember, your mental health journey is unique. While we hope this information is helpful, it is crucial to work directly with the qualified personnel for your specific needs. Thank you again for tuning in to Coach Soul, and we'll see you next time.